Uh, my name's Eric Prather. This is our Coffee and Science, and we are thrilled to have our presenter today, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. Um, uh, Dr. Carhart-Harris is the Ralph Metzer Distinguished Professor in Neurology and Psychiatry here and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. Um, Robin came to UCSF in 2021, where he founded the Carhart-Harris Lab in 2023. He came to us, and it was a really big deal. I remember very clearly when it was announced that this recruitment was successful. He came from Imperial College London, where he was previously had founded the Center for Psychedelic Research, which was the first of its kind in the world. Was kind of a gem in this research field, and so really exciting for him to bring his talents to the Bay Area. He got his PhD in psychopharmacology from the University of Bristol, and him and his colleagues have completed really kind of seminal work on multimodal human functional neuroimaging studies in LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and DMT, and has conducted kind of the leading clinical trials in psilocybin therapy for a variety of disorders, including depression as well as anorexia and fibromyalgia. In 2021, he published kind of seminal trial results on the comparative effectiveness of psilocybin versus escitalopram to treat depression, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. He's also published kind of field shifting findings on psilocybin and how it modulates the brain. And this work has been, published in all of the highest impact journals: Nature, Nature Medicine, Lancet, Psychiatry, Science Advances, PNAS, all of those sorts of things. And so we're really grateful for him to kind of be able to present this work to this broad community, because I know many of us are really interested in this area of scientific inquiry, as it is certainly kind of a future focused area of potential therapeutics. And so with that, really want to turn this over to Robin and hear his presentation for today. So thank you for joining us, Robin.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I'm just over the way in the Sandler. Tend to be in on Thursdays and Fridays, so if ever you want to reach out, please do. And yeah, be nice to get to know more people as I continue to settle in here at UCSF, just over 3 years in. So and love it here. Uh, so yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I keep changing the title of my talk, and this is the latest iteration. What are psychedelics and how do they work? So let's get flowing. And the first thing I want to address is let's see, is a definition of psychedelic. And this is an issue that I've become more bothered by, in a sense, recently, is sort of excessive lumping of a number of different compounds that are psychoactive and have strange subjective effects and do profoundly alter consciousness. But they get lumped in as psychedelics, and I just query that. Some of these compounds are quite different pharmacologically, phenomenologically, um, and risk profile as well. Compounds like, for example, ketamine or other dissociatives such as PCP are getting lumped into this too large a bucket of psychedelics, and I think it's becoming a bit of a problem. So the term psychedelic itself was coined in 1956 by a British psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, who conjoined two ancient Greek words. Psyche most literally means soul, and the other component means to make manifest or to reveal or make visible. So very poetic and profound, but the point of the term is to try and communicate that these are compounds that open up the mind and can reveal aspects of our minds or psyches that are ordinarily not fully visible and available to conscious awareness. And as poetic and abstract as that term is, I think it's valid and useful. And I'm not sure necessarily that we should lump in, for example, compounds like ketamine and PCP into that bucket. So when I refer to psychedelics in the field, others, my peers might call these compounds the classic psychedelics. They include drugs like psilocybin in psilocybe mushrooms or magic mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, DMT found in ayahuasca. And these are all compounds that have a certain pharmacology. Sometimes people call them serotonergic psychedelics. And we can be even more specific and know that they are compounds that stimulate as direct agonists a certain serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. And I'll just trust you can see these slides. I'm not 100% confident, so let me know if there's a problem, but you should be seeing on the left hand of the slide a PET image, a heat map of the distribution of serotonin 2A receptors in the living human brain, labeled with a ligand that is pretty selective for this serotonin receptor subtype, the 2A receptor. You can hopefully see that the expression is high in the cortex. It's lower in subcortical regions like the thalamus and basal ganglia, but very high in the cortex, and especially so in high-level cortical regions. Also, V1 is high, a strip in the primary visual cortex, but otherwise there's this principle that expression is especially high in high-level transmodal cortex that is expanded disproportionately in our species and is associated with somewhat species-specific functions like self-reflection, mental time travel, imagination, prospection, autobiographical recollection. Yeah, so that's where the key target of these compounds is found. And we know that the receptor is key to their action for a few reasons. There's a strong positive correlation between the affinity of candidate psychedelic drugs or a range of psychedelic drugs for the 2A receptor and the potency of those drugs. So the higher the affinity, the higher the stickiness, if you want, of the drug for the receptor, the more potent the drug. And a good example there might be LSD. Slightly awkward thing with my clicking through setup here. LSD, very high affinity, very potent. Microgram doses are psychoactive, psychedelic in their effects with LSD. Compare that to a compound like mescaline, where a typical dose might be closer to 0.5 gram. So 500 milligrams. Remember, LSD psychoactive in the microgram range, 1,000 of those in a single milligram. 500 milligrams of mescaline would be a typical to high dose. So a couple of orders of magnitude difference there, and that's explained in a sense or predicted. It's related to the affinity of those different drugs, LSD versus mescaline, for the 2A receptor. So that's a principle that's pretty solid. The image on the right there is again from PET imaging, looking at percentage occupancy of serotonin 2A receptors by a range of different dosages of psilocybin, higher doses, more 2A receptors occupied, and that's translating into the intensity of the subjective effects produced by those higher doses. So in a sense, the point to make there is the more of those 2A receptors bound to and stimulated by higher doses, the bigger the trip. So another kind of validation of the importance of this 2A receptor. If you block it with compounds that have a degree of selectivity for the 2A receptor and block it, they get in the way of the agonist, of the stimulating drug, the psychedelic. then that will block the trip. People won't trip. You can also give the psychedelic first and then give the blocker, and in a sense abort a trip as well. So further evidence when we're thinking of the classic psychedelics for the central importance of that 2A receptor. There are anomalies, there always are, but that principle is pretty solid. Now, I'm of a school of thought that when we're thinking of the mind, the brain is only ever half of the story, and in a sense, the mind, the subjective, is arguably the more fundamental. The brain is only as interesting as the mind, my colleague said to me once, and I think he's right, in the sense that, that's why we're so fascinated by that organ, the brain, is because we know how tightly coupled its function is to mental phenomena. So the phenomenology is essentially important. And I think if we're defining psychedelics to neglect phenomenology, say just go to pharmacology or even just go to behavior, I think we're blind spotting ourselves to arguably the more fundamental aspect of things. Remember that term psychedelic, soul revealing, comes from the phenomenology. So why should we neglect that side of things? Um, it would be an oversight to do that, I believe. So I'm going there now, and I've told you already about this chap, Humphrey Osmond, and the etymology there, making the soul manifest. But it's appealing to a construct of psychological insight that comes up in modern empirical research. We've developed a measure of psychological insight that is sensitive to the effects of classic psychedelics. And more recently, we've done some work looking at the subjective effects or the phenomenology of different categories of drugs, classic psychedelics with psilocybin as the sort of index drug in that category, MDMA, a serotonin releaser, um, uh, as another category, and ketamine, NMDA antagonist, dissociative anesthetic as another category. I'm making a long story short, there was a two-phase process of item generation through a Delphi process, consulting experts on these three different drugs, but then taking that to the public with an online survey. We got about 200 responses, just over, and asked people to dose dependently rate their experiences with each of those three compounds. They had to have used those three compounds previously to be eligible. And we found that there were three factors or a four factors solution in the data that could pick apart different categories of experience. In a sense, the statistical analyses were blind to what drugs people had taken, but based on the variance within people's responses, rating typical experiences with each drug and also the most intense experience with each drug, the data fell into these three or four categories, and lo and behold, they corresponded quite neatly to the three categories of drug that we were interested in. Where the initial part of that process was to try and come up with items referring to subjective experiences that the experts, that the Delphi members felt were somewhat specific to each drug. So you could see it, if you were being critical, as somewhat tautological, but nevertheless, it came out that there were these distinct categories. And if we look at the items, and you have any awareness of the different subjective effects of these drugs, they kind of make sense. MDMA items, I felt full of loving feelings. I felt full of love. So this pro-social, empathetic kind of quality to the experience. These compounds like MDMA are sometimes referred to as empathogens. Um, Another category, let's focus on ketamine with items including I felt like I was floating along in space. My awareness of my body in space felt strangely altered. Um, and then a third category that could be split in two, which to my eyes and experience is really somewhat specific for the classic psychedelics. So, for example, I could see deeply into the human mind. I could see especially deeply into my own mind or psyche. Um, and another factor within that psychedelic factor, if you want, that referred to the visionary or visual effects of yeah, visual effects. So with eyes open, I saw swirling, morphing, or flowing illusions. I saw dynamic, moving, geometric patterns. I would actually make the argument that this too is referring to some kind of, revelation of intrinsic functioning of the brain. That people see these geometric patterns is highly likely to be a sort of manifestation of intrinsic, even anatomical organization within the visual system. So, in a sense, you're seeing the internal workings of the visual system that are ordinarily latent, but are being made manifest by the excitatory effects of the psychedelic drug. So anyway, that was a useful exercise, I felt, for beginning to pass, beginning to split in a useful way between categories of compound that, in my view, are often, too sort of lazily lumped in as one bracket, and in a way that I feel is becoming somewhat problematic. For example, looking at risks and harms associated with dissociative anesthetics such as ketamine and PCP, and judging other, classic psychedelics like psilocybin that some could argue have a better risk benefit profile, and still, lumping these drugs in together. So I think there's some value in a sort of passing exercise, and that's why we did that little study there. Now, this is an overview, in a sense, a synopsis, a summary slide of the clinical trial research that has been happening with psychedelics for the last 20 years or so. And there's a lot there. That's one thing to pick up, and I probably haven't covered it all. There are publications, most weeks it seems, with new trial results. A lot in depression. We did the first depression trial, treatment-resistant depression trial, published in 2016, and there's been so much since then. And currently there are phase 3 trials underway that are a good way through, I believe. A couple of companies working on that with psilocybin, one for treatment-resistant depression, Compass Pathways, another for major depressive disorder, USONA. So that's probably the most promising area for classic psychedelic therapy. As many of you will know that MDMA therapy or MDMA-assisted psychotherapy knocked on the door of the FDA with phase 3 trial results last year, and wasn't successful at getting approval. That was MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. I believe that's being reviewed now. Things might change. We'll see. But personally, I thought that was unfortunate. But I would also say, just putting my cards on the table, that perhaps psilocybin therapy for depression has an even stronger case. We shall see. But those trials will be reading out and submitted to the FDA probably next year. And so that will be the next big milestone in this space in terms of, widespread potential legal access to psychedelic therapy for mental illness. But the take-home messages I want to emphasize would be that the way that psychedelic therapy, and I'm very intentional when I word it that way, we're not looking at just giving a drug, we're we're providing a drug in a certain way. It's a combination treatment, psychedelic therapy, as the name suggests, hyphenated in that way. So there's a way of delivering it that is quite specific, that changes the risk benefit ratio quite considerably, we believe, in favor of benefit mitigating risk, which involves, for example, psychological support ahead of time, rewinding a little bit further back, careful screening as well. So screening out risk factors such as personal family history of psychotic illness, extending that actually in my own trials to personality disorder. Um, yeah. Um, and then supervision of the session itself and curation of a certain kind of experience with music listening and psychological support, compassionate support during the experience and afterwards. We call that integration. Um, Psychological support afterwards to help people ground and work through any insights or challenges, tensions, conflicts that may have arisen either during or after the experience. So that would be one key take-home message, the assumed context-sensitive nature of the action or context-dependent nature of the action, and that virtually every trial has manipulated context in that particular way. Another take-home message would be the rapid improvements that are seen with this intervention. You can see that slide on the right. That's from that initial 2016 trial, psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression. So reliable drops in symptom severity early on at 1 week, and staying low for a good period of time. The effect size was largest, I believe, at 3 weeks. It might have been 5. But then, you know, some bounce back, some relapse that's so common, of course, in treatment-resistant depression. So it's no panacea, it's no magic cure that gets everyone well and they stay well. That would be unrealistic, but nevertheless promising. And I think that's where we are with this intervention. We can also look at, you know, absolute response rates and do a comparative analysis. I think most people would agree, dangerous thing to say, but some consensus from meta-analyses that response rates to, say, first-line antidepressants in depression bounce around 50%, whereas response rates with psilocybin therapy for depression, for MDD at least, are averaging around 60, even 80% in a couple of trials. So another sign of promise is the sheer absolute efficacy of psilocybin therapy in depression. Yeah, and the enduring nature, and that's a space where perhaps psilocybin therapy can be differentiable from ketamine. Ketamine requiring repeat administration. I think it's typically a couple of times a week for, say, 6 weeks, so pretty involved. Whereas the trials that have been carried out with psilocybin therapy, it's typically 2 doses separated by 2 or 3 weeks. That's about standard. So much fewer administrations. In a funny sense, much less drug dependent, this intervention. Of course, there's still a drug, but 2 doses of it compared to, you know, 40 plus daily administrations in a 6-week course of an SSRI, for example. The other take-home message would be this potential putative transdiagnostic action that this intervention is showing signal in a lot of different categories of illness. And we're going to see this more and more over the next, we'll see it this year and from here on, with more trials being carried out in OCD and different addiction disorders, eating disorders. So I think that'll be a clearer picture as we go through this year and beyond, is this potential transdiagnostic action. And for me, there's something really exciting about that, not just for me, of course, but, you know, that it might speak to something about this intervention that is targeting something core to psychopathology. Again, back to that classic debate question of, when to pass or split, when to lump. I guess what I'm doing here is making a bit of an argument for lumping and saying there might be a common denominator to psychopathology, as of course has been argued by many others, that some see as somewhat, regressive in a sense to go back to simple categories, lumping things together, but nevertheless, one type of intervention that's potentially targeting something core and common across different diagnostic categories. And, there may be good logic to why that might actually, be the case. We're going to be coming back to that point later on. And just a quick check-in of time, about halfway through, I believe. But now I'd like to take you through some models of action and back to that principle of, a sort of recognition of a somewhat essential duality between mind, brain, and body. There's, in my view, a lot to be said for psychological mechanisms, models of action. So here we're looking at a model that's predicting generic improvements in mental health measured through well-being in a naturalistic study of people taking psychedelics in the wild, tracked prospectively across time from before they take the psychedelic to a couple of weeks to months afterwards. We're looking at 2 weeks afterwards here and trying to predict that from different psychological phenomena. And the path to focus on would be the one in the center. And more, this is coming through as arguably the most reliable predictive model of response to psychedelic therapy, more reliable than, for example, this so-called mystical type experience that is arguably, somewhat vague as a construct and problematic. But emotional breakthrough, emotional release measured through items like I've faced emotionally difficult feelings that I usually put aside, are quite robustly and reliably able to predict first the quality of the experience that people have under the psychedelic, and then in turn the improvements in mental health. So here we predict psychological insight. It was actually scored the next day with items like I've become more conscious of aspects of my past that I usually ignore or not be fully aware of. So there's something, epistemic, something about self-development, psychological insight, mediated through the emotional breakthrough, the emotional release that people have. And these constructs seem quite close. The emotional release, the catharsis, what does that look like? It often looks like people, crying, strong emotion being released, but then that translating into psychological insight. There's usually a temporal offset there, the insight comes later. And then it's that pathway or mechanism that's predicting the improvements in mental health. We found similar things again. This is just another example. I like to show this because it's from a controlled trial. It's from that head-to-head of psilocybin therapy versus escitalopram for major depressive disorder. But we're seeing that classic component of psychotherapy, of the mechanism of action of psychotherapy, therapeutic alliance, and rapport, predicting the emotional breakthrough, release, or catharsis en route to drops in depressive symptom severity. So another component of the model, we see this in controlled research and the naturalistic sampling of people taking psychedelics in all sorts of different contexts. But it's, some reliable factors here: trust, therapeutic alliance, emotional catharsis, psychological insight en route to the improvements that are, creating some of this excitement around the therapeutic potential of psychedelic therapy. Now, a key question rightly asked is how much of this is placebo? What is placebo? How much of this, better way to say it, is how much of this is positive expectation causally driving the response? Is that all this is? People coming in, swept up in the hype that surrounds psychedelic therapy, although I would say there's been a bit of correction of that in recent times in the media, for example. But are they swept along by their expectations such that they're getting better just because they believe they're going to get better? Well, one way to address a question like that is to test it, to measure it. And we did that in the same trial, in the head-to-head. We measured expectations for response to escitalopram and separately expectations for response to psilocybin. Now, while it was found that there were higher expectations for psilocybin, when we looked at the variance and whether that could predict response, because of course it should if that principle holds, that higher expectations, better response, it should be there in the variance as a predictive relationship. And it was there for the escitalopram. So those who had the lowest expectations for escitalopram did the least well with it. They didn't really respond. Those who had better expectations did better. That was a reliable relationship across the different measures of mental health. But we found no such relationship for psilocybin. And this was a surprise. We measured it because we suspected it might be there. So to find a negative finding in this case was very interesting. In my mind, it makes a lot of sense in hindsight, that this is more, it's a glib way to put it, but I think a useful one. This is more than snake oil, It's not just people coming in with those high expectations and all of that, carrying them through. I think there's something much more substantive to this treatment action. We're going to go there in a moment as to what it is. But I don't think it's a compelling argument that it's all carried by some kind of positive expectation. At least that principle didn't hold in these data when we measured it. So what could it be if it's not positive expectation? We'll go there in a moment. But first of all, the follow-up data from this trial at 6 months. Depressive symptom severity improvements weren't significantly different between the two conditions, but I'm highlighting, cherry picking, if you want, those that were different, because I think there's something important here. And the domains that did separate significantly in favor of psilocybin are domains related arguably to things that really matter to people. Of course, dropping symptom severity, depressive symptom severity matters, but so does, feeling, getting enjoyment from life, feeling connected to other people, to one's own emotions, to a sense of purpose. We measure that with this connectedness scale in the top right. We can also look at something quite, mundane and important like work and social functioning. And we saw significantly greater improvements out at 6 months with psilocybin versus the escitalopram in that domain. And also a sense of meaning in life, critically important, and that separated in favor of psilocybin out at 6 months as well. And I think this is useful to show because it's, a more enduring response if we can indeed tie the causation to the treatment. I suspect we can in these domains. And it may speak to how this is different in a useful way that I think is going to matter to people. It's going to matter to patients, to patients' loved ones, and I think to clinicians as well, that they can really, get people back to a fuller quality of functioning and not just, for example, take the edge off symptom severity. This is another trial that we did in anorexia. This was single blind, single arm. We had a placebo. It was the first dosing session, and patients were blind to that, but the clinical team weren't, so single blind. And pretty promising in terms of making strong inferences about causation. It's harder in this design because of that single arm component. There were improvements early on with the placebo. So this would be more of an argument for a role of the psychotherapy in driving response, that early response, whether or not it would have sustained had they not subsequently got psilocybin. Doses 2 and 3 were high doses of psilocybin. The first dose was 1 milligram of psilocybin. But I think the therapeutic alliance that developed in that placebo dose first session was critically important. That's what patients communicated. I think a first trial like this, you want to see some signs of efficacy and safety, and then start improving the scientific rigor from there on. And I think this continues that process. The findings were promising. Remission rates of, I think, let's see, is it on here? I think 40% or 50% at 3 months. Of course, it takes time to improve symptom severity in anorexia, that people start being willing to eat again and potentially put on weight. And so the 3 doses happened 2 weeks apart within that 6-week period. So the endpoint at 6 weeks is right at the end of all 3 doses. And then 3 months is 3 months, I believe, subsequent to that primary endpoint. So promising, it's promising, but as always, more work needs to be done. But that we can say that is not a trivial thing, that it deserves, follow-up. We did see, in line with previous findings, that psychological insight scores predicted better responses, and specifically psychological insight scores scored after the high-dose psilocybin sessions. So that's a bit of evidence, one could argue, in favor of the high-dose psilocybin mattering over and above, or at least in addition to, the psychotherapeutic aspect of the causal mechanism. This is another trial, fibromyalgia syndrome, also recently completed just last year, also being written up currently. This was had quite a mechanistic focus with EEG recordings in session, and we do, as a rule, MRI, fMRI, pre-post. We find something in the EEG data that we found quite reliably now with a range of different psychedelics. But what's coming through in a couple of recent trials is that the magnitude of the brain change under the drug recorded with EEG, I'll explain what that is in a moment, is predicting improvements in mental health outcomes subsequent to the experience. In this case, we're seeing a relationship between psychological insight and the magnitude of the brain change, a quite robust brain change that we're seeing with the psilocybin. So what is that? I call it the entropic brain. We look at the predictability of the signal recorded with EEG, the scalp potentials across time. And if that activity is more diverse, varied, unpredictable, then that it will translate quantitatively as greater entropy in the signal. It's harder to predict, in a sense. The signal is more disordered or random. We find that with a range of different psychedelics. It's a dose-dependent phenomenon. You can also find it with other interventions that can produce psychedelic-like effects, such as flicker light or strobe light, meditation, inexperienced meditators, breath hold and breath work, REM sleep and dreaming. When people are fortunate enough to emerge from a disorder of consciousness, brain entropy will track with that. Yeah. Now, on the flip side, states of reduced conscious awareness, either with anesthetics or in disorders of consciousness or dreamless sleep, even with aging and disorders of aging. Brain entropy moves in the other direction. Activity becomes, in a sense, more predictable, less complex, less diverse, less entropic. So it's a principle that seems useful, but what's exciting in recent times is that it's not just relating to, in a sense, the intensity of the altered state of consciousness, which we're seeing here in this plot at the bottom right. It's also predicting more enduring changes in mental health. And that's what we found in this study. It's a study in healthy volunteers. Quick time check. Where under the high dose of psilocybin, these people had never taken a psychedelic before in their life. We record EEG activity during the trip, a placebo dose first, and then the high dose of psilocybin 1 month later. We found, first of all, the entropic brain effect, like I said, super reliable. It tracks with the intensity of the experience, peaking at peak intensity, dropping down as people come down from the drug. But this is the first plot I'll show with a predictive relationship between the entropic brain effect under the drug and subsequent psychological changes. First of all, psychological insight scored the next day, so that's something. But what's more exciting is that the entropic brain effect recorded. Whoop, someone might want to just mute their mic there if that's all right. The entropic brain effect recorded at the 3 time points could predict improvements in mental health measured with this generic index of mental health well-being out at 1 month. So a brain change as early as 60 minutes in. The magnitude of that brain change is predicting how well people will do, how much they'll improve, most of them improved, out at 1 month. And that held at 2 hours, which is closer to peak, and also at 4.5 hours. When we ran a path analysis or a mediation analysis, we found that the strongest model had psychological insight in there, where the insight scored the next day. And for me, I like this finding because it helps add explanation to the causation, that yes, you can go from the brain effect to the improvement. That's very exciting finding in itself and very valuable if it holds. But also to find that the relationship is stronger still if you plug in psychological insight the next day makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, that the drug is doing something to brain function, making brain function more complex, brain activity more complex. There's more bits of information in, if you want, or potential information in the signal. And that's translating into scored psychological insight the next day, as if that information is at least perceived as being useful. And then that relationship predicting the improvements in mental health, in a sense speaking to that self-realization, self-discovery or insight being useful in terms of, mental health change or, development. So we're excited about that result. It's only up as a preprint at the moment. A bit of trouble with Nature Neuroscience getting it over the line, but at least it's there in the public domain as a preprint, and it's going to have to go to another journal after close to 2 years of review, but whatever. So it's exciting, and these days, this entropic brain effect that we see most reliably in electrophysiology, whether measured with EEG or MEG in humans, also in animals, you'll see it with local field potential recordings, and you'll see it more clearly because of the resolution there, where we can extract the oscillatory components of the change and find that there are clear high frequency oscillations that are being expressed under, this is psilocin, a metabolite of psilocybin, that we can't see so clearly in humans with the less invasive methodology that we have. So what's the point there? It's that this entropic brain effect is likely being carried by an increase in high frequency oscillations, that it's not sheer chaos, it's not sheer randomness. It's more that that brain activity is being, I say, dialed faster and finer. So when we look with the high spatial resolution of fMRI and look at the expression of different spatial patterns of different granularity in the fMRI time series, the bold time series across time, it's finer grained, more granular patterns that are expressed more under the psychedelic, and these lower frequency spatial patterns, more coarse grained spatial patterns, are expressed less in the data. And that, I believe, is related to other effects such as the decrease in integrity of intrinsic brain networks, like the canonical so-called resting state networks. They break down, activity becomes more, spatial patterns become finer grained, and temporal oscillations become faster. So yeah, it's an effect that we see very reliably and may relate to therapeutic response. You know, my time management's not great for this talk, but just to go to principles rather than the details, perhaps in the remaining slides. We also look, as I've said, at the brain pre-post psychedelic therapy. And what we found there could be summarized as a potential carryover of the acute action of the psychedelic. So if the psychedelic, in this case psilocybin, is breaking down structure, breaking down brain networks, making brain networks more communicative with each other, more flexible in their communication style, more open. We see that clearly under drug, but in a couple of studies, we're also seeing it after drug therapy, after psilocybin therapy for depression. And the greater that effect, the better the response. So networks opening up, becoming more communicative with each other, that's translating into better responses, or relating to and predicting actually better responses to the psilocybin therapy. So that speaks to a principle of a enduring flexibility, a move from systems that are somewhat segregated functionally from each other to systems, networks that are more communicative and open with each other. So another principle is that, borrowed from hierarchical predictive processing, the model of mind and brain function that says we experience much of the world through our internal predictive models. That's how the brain and mind work ordinarily, but under psychedelics, the influence of our predictive models is dialed down. That's the relaxed in relaxed beliefs. Beliefs is interchangeable with models, assumptions, hypotheses, priors, predictions, relaxed predictions, in a sense, under psychedelics. So our assumptions about what's what are relaxed, and one effect of that perhaps is this, percolation of information that ordinarily is suppressed out from conscious awareness. And if that's how psychedelics work, you twin it with psychedelic therapy, and you're potentially harnessing, I'm glossing over things now, but you're harnessing that window of plasticity, plasticity defined as the ability to be shaped or molded or to change. That's what it means in its most fundamental sense, plasticity. You're harnessing that enhancement of plasticity and trying to guide it in a positive therapeutic direction. And really that's the model. That's the essence of the model. And why could that be helpful for targeting the core of psychopathology common across different diagnostic categories? Well, perhaps because a lot of psychopathology is in a sense the opposite of a plastic presentation rather than an openness, flexibility, and ability to change. There's an inability to change. Ways of thinking, feeling, behaving become entrenched. They get stamped in, they're overly reinforced. And that's the core of the problem. And it just expresses in different ways in different psychopathologies. But if that's the core of the problem, then to have an intervention that can target it, it starts to make sense that it could have this transdiagnostic action. Given time and hopefully some interesting questions, I could conclude things here. I can always share my slides as well. It's really the final slides are measuring this rebus effect, measuring people's confidence in their beliefs, seeing that they're overweighted, pathological beliefs are overweighted across different disorders, and that weighting, that confidence in these unhealthy beliefs drops down as soon as you introduce the psilocybin, the psychedelic. It doesn't change when you give placebo. So that's another exciting finding. Bit of complicated context that perhaps we'll leave for another day. Thank you again for having me along, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was an amazing tour de force. We did get a lot of questions in the chat. I'm not exactly sure how to prioritize them, but I guess in order in which they were received. And so I know we only have time for kind of one or two of them, but Philippe Golden, are you able to unmute yourself and just ask your question?
Yes,
Maybe.
gladly. Given, is there an age-dependent effect for different specific psychedelics, given that reduce in plasticity? In one way, you've kind of answered that. I asked the question very early, and I said, yeah, but I'll leave it there. That
That's a good one.
age-dependent effects. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of evidence that trips are less intense. It's a glib way to put it, but yeah, the effects are less intense as people age. 2A receptors drop. Even controlling for gray matter loss, 2A drops away quite considerably from middle age. But people still have the effects, and you can just up the dose. In terms of improvements, there's no change there. I mean, in terms of, therapeutic potential, it's there at least as strong in older people, um, which is important and yeah, potentially very valuable, of course. There is a bit of evidence that older people benefit from having experiences in groups. So I don't know if that's a loneliness factor, and so the pro-social aspect of having the experiences in groups, but we have found that, which was quite interesting as well. But you think of canalized beliefs, kind of getting stuck in one's ways as we age. And so there's something quite interesting there as well. There is a paper you could look up, Pasquini et al. I think Lorenzo Pasquini is first author, Hannes Kettner, Kettner, as the senior author, where we've looked at data in older adults. Yeah. Thank you.
Amazing. A number of these questions are kind of get at the kind of heterogeneity of people or kind of potential moderators of these effects. And so I don't know if you can speak just briefly about people that may have variation in the 5-HT2A receptors.
Mm.
And then maybe just briefly, if you've also looked at people that have had kind of historical trauma versus not, like ACEs and things like that a lot of people in this group are
Yeah.
interested in,
Yeah.
whether that either those kind of mechanistically or just kind of like life experience moderate any of these effects.
Yes, we've got a paper having measured the ACE, and so looking at a subsample of people with histories of adverse childhood experiences, and it was quite promising, as in there were just as strong, if not stronger, improvements in mental health outcomes in those who have those histories. I think they may have had more challenging experiences during, but in terms of longer term outcomes, it's quite promising. There's a caveat I'll put in here, which is that, there are risk factors for psychedelics, and not every psychopathology fits the model of canalization as well. Uh, we can think of psychotic states, states of delirium, perhaps ADHD, where rather than getting stuck in a rut, there's a pathological, lack of some structure, perhaps. Um, and we have seen in some of our data that people with a history of diagnosed personality disorder are at elevated risk of less positive changes in their mental health, is actually the more accurate way to say it. Some of them got worse. But looking at those who fell into what we call the bottom margin for changes in well-being, we then looked at psychiatric history to see whether we could predict that. This is in naturalistic data, so pretty big data relative to trials at least, and found that disproportionately it was people with a history of personality disorder that were actually 4 times more likely than the rest of the sample to fall into that bottom margin, to be the worst cases, if you want. And that kind of makes some intuitive sense. It speaks to some of the sort of informal observations that we've picked up from doing trials in TRD, for example, where comorbid personality disorders are quite common. The extra challenge of having good therapeutic alliance and rapport is likely part of it. The emotional instability, the agitative, psychologically agitative action of psychedelic therapy, that it challenges defense mechanisms, for example, may explain things to some extent in relation to that finding. And it's just a useful cautionary note. There are other bits of data around history of personal history of any psychotic illness and family history, also bipolar 1 as negative predictors. An emotionally avoidant personality structure, another negative predictor. So yeah, that's focusing on the negative, but yeah, worth bringing up.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And so we're at time. So thank you for everyone who attended. I hope Robin's email was all over this. So if people have questions, maybe they can kind of follow up with you.
By all means, I'd love that. I'd love that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love to have a better connection with psychiatry. And I'm not too far away, just a stone's throw, really,
Yeah.
more or less.
We appreciate that. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody joining. Next month, we will have Samantha Santos Baez, who will be speaking on time-restricted eating and its effect on lipid metabolism. So I hope you join us on February 11th. We're going to upload this to our YouTube channel so you can rewatch it and rewatch it. A lot of good stuff here. Thank you so much, Robin, again for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And for
Pleasure.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take
Bye.
care.